Hey everybody, it's time again for a Let's Study edition. Today we're going to look at a very divisive game in an effort to answer, I guess, the ultimate question when it comes to players' like or dislike of this game. This is obviously Dark Souls, which I think you could say this game's cult status is, I think it's high enough now to where this game can just be called acclaimed or whatever word you want to use for a highly accepted game. So the principal question that surrounds this game, and obviously I'm going out of bounds, as it were, for Let's Study. We're not just looking at this game as it exists or on its own merits on its own 2 feet. We're sort of thinking about the greater uh, questions surrounding the game culturally, and again, that is Dark Souls fair? Is Dark Souls fair, or is Dark Souls unfair? What is a fair game versus an unfair game? What is where is the line between difficult and hard? The first thing I want to address is the idea that a big part of this game being fair or unfair seems to me to be wrapped up in some really unnecessary places. And what I mean by that is that it comes from a really, really unfortunate habit of people taking their personal experience and treating it as if it's the only experience. And that's obviously something that goes well outside of just video games. But in addition to that, there's also ego and self-denial that can get in the way. If there are two people that play this game, and one of these players, is very fond of using walkthroughs, and thus knows where a lot of the deeply hidden information that gives you an advantage in this game is, and then someone else doesn't use a walkthrough and finds the game very obtuse and steep and too difficult. One player, the former player, may be so inclined to think that they are a better gamer or that they are somehow superior, and all these kinds of things happen. And there's a lot of immaturity that surrounds this game, for no real good reason. So I want to ignore obviously those short-sighted sort of forum discussions that really have no value, and just talk about the nature of the game and what the game includes itself and that kind of thing. So, what is Dark Souls? Dark Souls is essentially in the Super Metroid Castlevania school, where exposition is just sort of almost non-existent. You're put into a role, you get very little context, you get some atmosphere, but you really don't have anything to go on. There's very little direction. It's a very exploration-driven game. It's mostly hack and slash with combat, though it has RPG elements as well. So, from a narrative standpoint, there's almost no narrative to speak of. The narrative is just something you have to discover or investigate for yourself through your explorations and throughout the world, this incredibly bleak world that your character is put into. So, now then, is the game fair or unfair? What does that mean? What's really going on when we talk about Dark Souls or any game being fair versus unfair? What we're attempting to do is quantify something that's very complex and very detailed into something very oversimplified. What's happening? It's the same. It's the same way with games or films or whatever getting a numerical value, a review of 3.5 stars, 2 thumbs up, 9 out of 0.2 out of 10. These are just generalizations where we've taken all the information and all the details of this very long, complicated, interactive experience, and we're trying to quantify it in one word or one number. And that's not very good. So talking about being unfair or fair, all that's doing is taking the great sum of your experiences with the game and attempting to stick it into a very, very small box. So that's not very productive. So I think what's more productive is to talk about what aspects of the game may come across to some as fair and also accordingly unfair. I'm not going to label the game as fair or unfair based on my personal experience, because that's just all that's doing is putting me in as just one more voter in this great consensus on the internet, or this argument about whether it's fair or unfair or whatever. I do think that it's, speaking of fair or unfair, I do think it's unfair that anyone would call this game not challenging. I think that's a bit delusional. I don't think that's I think that's sort of playground bragging at that point. I think you're in just self-denial. By pretty much any measure, I would say From Software games and Dark Souls are considerably more difficult than the average video game on the market. I would also like to dispel the notion that a fair or unfair game completely dictates a game's quality. I think it's one of many factors, but I hardly think, even if you were to decide that Dark Souls is an unfair game at times, that does not make it invalid. In fact, a lot of its appeal is in its difficulty, as has been documented to death, and so on and so forth. So let's talk a little bit about what is fair and what is unfair in Dark Souls, from my perspective, as far as individual elements. I think it's 100% fair for a game to tell you early on about the control schemes. I don't think it should be expected that a player in this age should bring up an FAQ or something before they start the game to learn these things. I think tutorializing things is fine, and Dark Souls does that, and it does it minimally. So I think that's fair. I don't think it's fair when your physics allow for enemies to swing through walls, but for your physics to bounce off walls. Many times in this game, you can reach a situation where you are in a narrow corridor with enemies, and many times their enemies will go through the wall, and your same sword or your same action or similar will sort of counter itself and sort of get you killed. I don't think that's very fair. I think expectation is tricky in this game, in that unless you're tiptoeing, there are a lot of places to die, and unless you're willing to embrace trial and error gameplay, I think that's somewhat unfair. If you're okay with, essentially you're fair or unfair when it comes to environmental hazards, comes down to unless you're willing to baby step frame by frame, or you're willing to look up sort of what dangers are coming, I think it's unfair. But if you're okay with dying to those sorts of things and then using that as your jumping off point to not dying next time, I think it's very fair. But it depends on where you fall with that. I want to talk about something that nobody ever addresses, as far as I know, and that is fair or unfair elements that are outside game mechanics. Dark Souls, especially on PC, I haven't played the console version enough recently to really know. But on PC, the loading screens, like with many games, are informative. And this is a game where information can be very crucial. Is it fair for a game to have loading screens with info that go by so fast that you can't read them? So I find that to be true in Dark Souls, and I think that's very unfair. If your loading screens are so fast that a reasonable or even fast reader could not read the information presented, that's fundamentally unfair. And keeping in with the tech aspect of it, Blighttown on PC without an outside patch fix is notorious for being laggy. Um, is it fair that that's laggy? What is the difference between where do we draw the line at cheating in a game like this? If I am attaching an outside patch, a fan-made independent patch, to create better technological circumstances for one area of the game, am I cheating? How many things do I have to check in an FAQ, or how many things do I have to Google before it's cheating? And see, a lot of your feelings on the spectrum of what constitutes help in these regards affects whether or not you think the game is fair or not. The first boss fight, the now famous Asylum Demon boss fight, you enter the room and he drops. And there is a door on the left side of the room that you can run in and sort of create a temporary escape. Now, I think if you do not run into that door fast enough, that the gate will shut before you can get through. Is that fair or unfair? Is the boss any harder or easier based on if that door is shut or not? And is there any way to know that beforehand? That's another one that's extremely gray. Is having a game with classes where it is more or less understood later on that classes are irrelevant, is that fair or unfair, or is that just sort of iffy design? Is the game preying on your expectations for class-based skills and games? All that really depends. The combat for some people can be extremely rewarding. Seamus Young, who I believe is a game developer and designer, wrote a great essay illustrating another one of the great reasons many players feel that this is a great game, and many players feel that it's just impossibly hard and whatever. Different players react to different stimulus. Some players' brains need more context for gratification, and other players, for lack of a better term, enjoy the little things. So if you are the type of person who needs story, characters, greater context, and you need that enforcement more frequently for your brain to release dopamine at the level you would like, at the rate you would like, you may not enjoy Dark Souls because you have to spend lengthy periods of time in the same sections of the game with little explanation for why you're there beyond the atmosphere or what you care to deduce or what you care to go out of your way to find and things like that. Whereas another group of players very much enjoys the dopamine release that comes with reactive play, blocking a shield at just the right time, things of that nature. So that's a very fundamental reason why some players enjoy this game and some don't, though I don't think that necessarily has much to do with the question of fair or unfair. So personally, I've played this game well over. I've played 3 different times. Once for just an immense amount of time, another for like a brief period of time on console years ago, and then another time. So I've experienced a lot of different ways to play this game, and that is certainly one of the charms. I think that's one of the ways that the game becomes so successful. But I guess the biggest question for me personally is, what is gained from the obtuse nature of some of the game's difficulty? I think obtuse and unfair are close to synonymous when it comes to these sorts of gameplay questions. The mystery, the atmosphere, all these things are wonderful, but what does the game have based on these things that it wouldn't have had it been made and developed slightly differently? And that's to say, more intuitively or things like that. The idea that a game not holding your hand is the sort of derogatory term for a game that's difficult, though that in of itself is also a spectrum. The game could very well have not told you what those initial controls were when you first walk out of your cell in the first area in the Undead Asylum. it could have made you pilot the giant bird that carries you to Lordran, but it didn't. Is that hand-holding? Why is that sort of hand-holding okay in that scene and not in another? And it ultimately comes down to, I think, an undue sense of superiority. There are, unfortunately, a lot of people who are immature, and they measure some of their would-be worth on feeling better, as if, beating a difficult video game somehow makes them a better person than another player, and that's obviously patently untrue. So I hope this has raised, or at least given some people some things to think about this game, both people who enjoy it and who don't enjoy it, about how unfair it is to base a game's worth or make grand declarations about a complex experience based on such a simple idea like the word fair or like the word unfair. I don't think calling the game fair or unfair, one or the other, is fair. Appropriately enough, because it's a more complex experience than that. It's got lots of different mechanics. It's got lots of different things going on. Certain aspects of the game can be good and unfair. Certain aspects of the game can be perfectly fair and still be bad. This game, whether you ultimately subscribe to enjoying it or not enjoying it, you're doing it a disservice by dismissing it as fair or unfair and using that as your reason for enjoying it or not enjoying it. So thank you very much once again to everyone who listened to this installment of Let's Study. Feel free to catch my streams. I have a Twitch channel which is located in the description for this. And I will see you guys later on with hopefully a game with maybe some more definitive answers. Take care.